Welcome to the CDI CTO Podcast presented by CDI Studios.
Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Felix Vargas. I'm the CTO of Security for CDI. This is the CTO Podcast. So we do a series of podcasts at CDI focused on getting to know our vendors better, not only the technology but the human element. And today I am pleased to announce that we do have Brad Moldenhauer joining us from ZScaler. Brad has an extensive security experience starting in the government space all the way up to working at ZScaler. So I look forward to getting to know him a little better and understand his trajectory. Brad, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Felix. I'm looking forward to the dialogue today.
Yeah, excellent. The funny thing is that Brad lives in Alexandria, Virginia, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I live in Potomac, Maryland. That's about, what, 20 minutes away?
20 minutes away, yeah.
We came up to New Jersey to talk, but we do have a great facility here and a great studio that lends itself to these kind of conversations.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. So thanks for joining. And so we're first going to start just getting to know you, right? So I know that a lot of listeners are very interested in ZScaler, but I think it's important to understand the human element and get a better understanding of where you came from. Sure. I'm very curious. I've lived in the DC area practically all my life, and I've somehow avoided to work for the government. Yeah. which is interesting. And every time that I talk to somebody that's in my industry, like, "Oh, you work for the government?" I'm like, "No, I don't." I stayed in the private sector my entire career. So you did have a brief stint within the government in a non-security role, correct?
Yeah. So it was interesting. First of all, I kind of tripped my way into security in a way. When I was in undergrad in the mid-90s, I went to school. I had aspirations to be a sports journalist. So, I studied like English and mass communications. And I remember when I got out of college, the first job that I could get was really, I guess, at that time, I started using computers a lot more, so I just had a general interest in it. And the only job I could get wasn't in the journalism area, but it was as a systems analyst for essentially a defense integrator working on site at the Defense Logistics Agency. Yeah, and what's interesting about that job is I don't think anyone who worked there at the time wanted it, because it was right around the time where GISRA was becoming FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, and what ultimately became the federal certification and accreditation program for major applications and general support systems. Well, with that came a lot of information assurance documentation requirements. So I was kind of selected to, make sure that I could understand exactly what we were doing from a systems perspective and then start documenting what I was told are information security controls within something called a system security authorization agreement, which ultimately became the system security plans that we see today.
Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. That's great background. So the transition seemed to be very natural, right? So it was something that you joined this organization and you saw the opportunity to sort of focus on this documentation. Yeah. Did you, because I noticed you have some certifications on the security side, was that reactive after getting exposed to security? Did you say, okay, well, let me go and get certified?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, we had a lot of individuals who were, developers and engineers. None of them wanted anything to do with this information assurance initiative, right? Right. And at that time, I think security was still a little bit nascent, but I'll tell you, I took a real liking to it because, at that time I did have, a level of privileged access at that time. So I was getting to understand exactly what we were doing with technology, and then coupled with kind of the birth of, if you will, of implementing security controls. And I really just kind of liked the structure around it. And I said, I need to get smarter about this because obviously I spent 4 years, in an arts and letters program, learning how to write and talk to people, which actually served me well because if you think about it, people that work in technology, they usually get to that because they don't like interpersonal interactions. Right. They're engineers. They like playing with things. I was a little bit differently. I came at it differently. So yeah.
No, that's great. And then it looks like you transitioned into a CISO role at a healthcare organization. So healthcare is near and dear to my heart. That's really where I started my security journey as well. And that particular vertical has its own challenges, right? One thing that I learned is how critical security can be because we have lives at stake, right? And so if a hospital goes down, the effects of that could be devastating.
Yeah.
So can you talk me through some of your experiences there, how it was working for a healthcare organization, and any sort of knowledge that you could share as to not only the people process, but also the technology around security?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because, you mentioned at the beginning, living in DC and having a career, at least in or supporting public service. Well, I was the opposite. I was trying to get out of that. And my first role out of that was for a global health and human services provider, a company called Maximus, where I was given a security leadership role where I managed their data security and privacy program. And we had a lot of federal and local and state government contracts for CMS and HHS.
Okay.
So that's where I started getting my first exposure to that industry, and obviously the HIPAA security and privacy rules. So my next role after that was at Virginia Hospital Center, where I was hired as really their first CISO. They had never had that role before. And yeah, it was certainly, I wouldn't say a culture shock to me, but it was one of the more complex environments I had seen at that time. So, and you're familiar with it. All the disparate electronic health record systems, ambulatory to your financial ones, and really kind of seeing how those all integrated. But I guess the biggest shock to me was the reliance on vendor support for those. And that was one of the first things I saw where I was like, hey, we've got a real exposure here, where essentially we had a real big organization that was supporting most of these internal EHRs, and they would have a pool of about 500 support engineers. They were using one account to access our network in those systems.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was very eye-opening for someone like me who had, kind of come from, the government space where even at that time we were implementing discretionary access controls, role-based access controls. Yeah, so that was really eye-opening when I first got there.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me is, I got into security because there was a ransomware event where, all systems down, fetal heart rate monitors were down. I get the call, hey, those are down, we need to restore them. Yeah. Generally speaking, hospitals are very focused on providing the best patient care, right? And sometimes, security may not play a major role strategically for the organization. And there's some elements, and this is true of every sort of vertical, there are some elements of, we just had something happen, now we have to respond, right? And so that's unfortunate, and something that, I'm very passionate about avoiding, right? Starting with disaster recovery, making sure that, we can recover quickly. But what was evident was identity and access management were, not as mature, right? And making sure that, from an identity provider perspective, you don't have 100 admin domains, right? or domain admins within your Active Directory architecture. So all things that are important, and I think that experience, helped you tremendously from a privacy perspective as well.
Oh,
right?
absolutely, yeah. And that was my first role too. And it's interesting. I see this in a lot of my customer engagements too, where people that are in our roles of security leadership, a lot of us come from this same background. We started out as IT professionals, and when they take a look at risk, primarily it's from, an IT risk standpoint, right?
Right.
And when I was at that hospital, that's where I started looking at risk a little more holistically from a business standpoint. So, you mentioned, usually we're just looking at IT risk and how it could impact our business. Well, at Virginia Hospital Center, I started looking at it a little bit differently. Even though we weren't publicly traded, I started taking a look at, like board level risk and like potential risk to society, right? So if we did have some kind of compromise or a breach of one of our electronic health record systems, one of our ambulatory systems or radiology or GI, loss of life was a real concern, right? So it was a real growing opportunity for me in that environment. I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Right. No, that really, the loss of life piece is what really got me, on this train and very focused on security. Excellent. So you went government, you had some healthcare experience, and then you shifted to the private sector.
Yeah.
Right? What was that transition like, going from government to the private sector?
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that in a way it was difficult for me to get that opportunity. I was finding a lot of organizations were just like, okay, well, this guy has worked on site at some pretty sensitive organizations, because I was working at a defense logistics agency. Then I spent 4 years for the law enforcement arm of the Department of State, Bureau of Diplomatic Security. And then after that, I was working for the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, the Department of Energy. And, I think that where I certainly had the credentials and qualifications to meet specific roles that I was looking for, I don't know what it was, but my sense was the private industry, like hiring managers, were like, well, this guy's probably just been, geared to follow the lay of the land, so to speak, because I think there's this view of, our public sector that's just everything is procedural. It's down to the bat. In the private sector, you need to have your wits and situational awareness around you to kind of make good decisions. So it was very challenging to actually get out of that. But once I did, I would say the things that I was able to draw upon, which is odd, is that a lot of those administrative controls were missing. Right? Like a lot of the policies and procedures weren't there, but hey, we've got all these tools and we've implemented them and we feel like we're treating technology risk sufficiently. Maybe not efficiently, but sufficiently.
Right.
So that was one of the things where I was able to make an immediate impact, kind of drawing back to my public sector experience.
Okay. Well, that's excellent.
Yeah.
And then you eventually transitioned from private to the vendor space. And before you did that, and it's funny because obviously you're from the DC area, there are a lot of legal offices, law offices in the DC area. So what was legal to vendor, like what was that transition like? And what challenges did you find in the legal space specific to, potentially SASE type solutions or, just security in general?
Right, yeah. So I took over my role at Steptoe in, I think, early 2015. And I right off the bat, I loved the legal industry. Okay. And the reason that I did is because given my experience in the public sector and then within healthcare, one thing I noticed was the legal vertical doesn't have any specific regulatory requirements. A lot of them are privately owned organizations, but they have clientele in every vertical, right? So I was able to draw upon my past experiences to really drive impact. And that was my first role too, where I reported directly to our general counsel. And I'll be honest with you, I learned more about risk from this graduate from Harvard Law School than I ever have from any kind of technology manager. Yeah. So, but one of the things that I noticed immediately, because I kind of when I went into that role, I was looking at it from a, people break it down like a 30, 60, 90. What is it that we have in place? Who are the stakeholders I need to meet? Where are we currently at with this program, and where do we need to go? And one of the things that was just apparent to me, and I think I see this with a lot of customers, and I'm sure you do too, is that we were kind of going through what I would call an application transformation at that time.
Sure, yeah.
Some of our systems of record were moving to SaaS and moving away from on-prem. But the other interesting thing was, and the way that I kind of tell it is, I was dealing with pre-pandemic conditions long before the pandemic. Lawyers are international globetrotters.
That's a good point.
Right?
Yep.
So they spend, I would say, on average, probably 75% of their time out of the office, traveling to client sites and wherever else. And the challenge that I was seeing was, if you're moving more and more applications to SaaS, and these individuals with authorized business devices are out in the wild, and they're no longer having to connect back to my network through my wonderful stack of security controls, well, now I'm in a situation where risk is unchecked, unmanaged, and potentially unmitigated.
100%. So it's interesting you bring that up, because I look at the world now, right, pre-COVID, post-COVID, right? And if you look at ZScaler and SASE in general, there were particular verticals that were aligned to solutions like that because of challenges they had around distributed workforce. COVID made practically everyone go to a remote workforce sort of strategy, and it really ramped up SASE adoption. Right? And so you saw a lot of organizations say, hey, we flipped a switch and everyone's working remote, but at what cost? Right? Did we just plug a bunch of holes within our security architecture to facilitate access? And then that's where we saw an increase, right, in cybersecurity incidents, right? And I still feel like we're in that storm now. Right?
Absolutely.
So as you transitioned to ZScaler, that was right around that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Oh yeah, right. So I joined ZScaler, I would say 3 or 4 months right into the pandemic, so in 2020. And it's kind of an interesting story because I was finishing our global deployment of ZScaler Private Access, which was initially looked at as our remote access modernization project.
Sure.
And I wanted to make sure that was, I kind of put the bookmark on, or the ending on that project before I made the transition over. But it was something we were working on months leading up to that. So yeah.
Interesting. So at Steptoe, you started with ZPA.
No.
Okay.
So yeah, even going back before that. So to finish the one point, what I noticed in 2015 was, these lawyers that were traveling everywhere with those authorized devices, I was losing more and more visibility of them. But here's the scenario that people like you and me would have seen, is that, okay, that device is authorized to be on my business network, and I haven't seen it in 3 weeks.
Right.
If it comes back into my office and
100%.
something malicious is installed on that, well, now I got lateral movement risk.
100%. Yeah.
So really what was kind of becoming apparent to me, and I think, others had noticed this at the time, is that people were becoming the perimeter. And the other thing that we always need to do is we need to look, I would say, horizontally in our organization. So, a peer of mine, the CIO, he was looking at what he needed to do at that time. We had about 15 global offices, a couple co-location data centers, and we had maybe 5 global internet breakouts. Or he wanted to introduce local internet breakouts to all those offices. Now, here's the challenge that I saw there. We had, a proxy appliance instrumented on 4 of those 5 gateways. And I'm like, okay, well, why don't we have it on all 5? And the one, by the way, was in the London office. And I thought it might have been EU privacy concerns. They're like, no, we just couldn't afford it. It was a cost trade-off. I'm like, okay, so you didn't tell me we were waiting for the red coat model, right? Or something like that. So, but if we couldn't afford to instrument 5, how would we ever be able to, instrument 15, right?
Right.
So that's when I started looking at, okay, you know what? All of these other lines of business, like marketing for CRM or HR for HRIS, they were moving to SaaS. Is it really that much of a question to say maybe we can have our security delivered from a SaaS model too?
Right.
And that's when I found ZScaler. Yeah.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the major benefits from my perspective on the ZScaler side, it's that it's a SaaS model, and, and the industry's shifting to SaaS very rapidly. So that makes a lot of sense. So what's the day in the life of a CISO at ZScaler? And actually, you're part of the office of the CISO.
That's correct,
right?
Yeah.
So what's your day like? Are you traveling all over the place? Are you divided across the U.S.?
Yeah.
Do you have East Coast, West Coast? What's that like?
Yeah, so we are a global outfit. Currently on our active roster, there's 8 of us.
Okay.
There's 4 of us in the Americas region, 2 of us in the EU, and then 2 of us in the APJ region. Okay. One of the things I think that the common attribute you will see with most of us is that we're all former ZScaler customers in some respect, whether we were, an economic buyer or, an operator of the actual solution. But all of us had, pretty senior security roles at our former employers. And yeah, it's an interesting transition because, and ZScaler did a really good job when they were talking to me about this, because as we've covered, I've never worked for a solution provider.
Right.
So I wanted to make sure that this role was something that, one that I would like and one that I could, add value to. And it became apparent to me that I think that I would be good at this. And here I am 3 years later, and it's going good. But a day in the life, there's a couple of different things we do. But one thing I would start off by saying is, our team spends about 90% of our time in a customer-facing capacity.
Right.
So from there, a number of services pop up. We obviously all have pretty unique digital transformation journey stories.
Right.
So I tell that story a lot to kind of, give customers some real insight on what that journey looked like. Yeah. For current customers, obviously we work very closely with our product management team. So, we can do independent policy evaluations. But the other thing is, too, since we work very closely with our security research arm, Threat Labs, we understand what that threat landscape is looking like. And since we're operators, that one of the great things about ZScaler is, I'm sure there's a marketing slide that says, hey, 8 out of the 10 biggest healthcare customers, 7 out of the 10 biggest banks, 5 out of the biggest insurance providers. Well, all of these verticals are able to use the solution because of its tremendous flexibility. So one of the things that we do is by understanding what that threat landscape looks like, how can we leverage or extend the platform in terms of like acceptable use scenarios or really getting ahead of that risk curve? And we advise customers on those features and functionality a lot.
That's great. Yeah, I'm also part of the office of the Octo.
Yeah.
Right. So there's about 6 of us, and I also spend 90% of my time customer facing, and a lot of the time I spend actually in these types of conversations, learning more and getting to know folks in the vendor ecosystem and the partner ecosystem.
Yeah.
So we've thrown terms around in this conversation, acronyms, right? We've thrown SASE around, there's SSE, there's Zero Trust. I feel like there's a lot of confusion there, right? Around understanding why we went from SASE to SSE first, right? And then Zero Trust, how do SASE and SSE fit into the Zero Trust architecture, et cetera? Can you elaborate on those terms a bit?
Yeah, and it's interesting because what I like looking at is, obviously I chose solutions like ZScaler and CrowdStrike, cloud delivered services, back in 2015. And what became apparent to me is, as we go to this moment right now, is I was embarking on a SASE venture and I had no idea. And then ultimately, the first time I ever heard the term Zero Trust was, I don't know, probably 2017, 2018. I had no idea what that was. But yeah, I really enjoyed when, I guess it was Gartner that introduced the whole SASE term, and it was something I guess that I fundamentally believed in. Cloud delivered security services in the areas of, secure web gateway, cloud access security brokers, and then ultimately Zero Trust. And that model made a lot of sense to me, and I guess what ultimately came out of it, and I think this makes sense too, is where we separated it out to that security service edge and just really decoupling it from the network virtualization side, or what we now know as SD-WAN. So that made a lot of sense, but where the confusion started growing for me is, well, wait a minute, is Zero Trust part of SASE or is it not?
Right.
And then ultimately, I think that the security service edge was not just focused on, how we protect, our businesses and our customers and our users from web threats, but also let's go ahead and add our private application ecosystem into that too. And that's where I think that the Zero Trust model fits pretty nicely within that bigger SASE SSE picture.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and you said something very interesting. So first, let's just so security access service edge, right?
Yeah.
Was where Gartner, it's a Gartner defined term, which involved the networking aspect of an identity based security model, right? And Gartner removed that, right? And now there's another term, and both of them are still terms that Gartner does research on and grades vendors on. But SSE, Security Service Edge, is more focused on application access, not necessarily on the networking and SD-WAN elements, which is interesting. And I know that Zscaler is agnostic to the networking component, correct?
Yeah.
Right?
So we look at those, and not just SD-WAN vendors, but any kind of networking vendor as part of our partner ecosystem.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah, no, and from a Zero Trust perspective, the way that we define it, there are 3 guiding principles, and the first is verify explicitly, which is what what you were just referencing. Impossible travel.
Right.
What is your device posture? And then provide least privilege after we have established a level of trust with that individual, right? And then decrease the blast radius, right? Make sure that you can't move laterally, right? And I think SASE and SSE fit right into that, and it makes a lot of sense, right? And they're all within the same ecosystem, if you will. So, talking a bit about Zscaler, right? What's the elevator pitch, right, for Zscaler, or for SASE for that matter, right? Why should an organization care, right? And what problems is it solving?
Yeah, so I have this conversation a lot, and the way that I would kind of frame it is, I think and this is going to resonate with everyone, is that our world is changing, right? New business needs, cloud adoption, mobility, threat landscape volatility, privacy regulatory requirements, IoT, just to name a few. To meet the requirements of this rapidly changing environment, we need a highly flexible and dynamic architecture that will allow quicker adoption of technology, usage models, and other capabilities that also gets away from the legacy trust models that were binary and static. And this is where ZScaler really, ZScaler provides that architecture that I would say protects and enables our customers and their business outcomes.
Right. Yeah. 100%. And I always say that, post-COVID, organizations did really interesting things to facilitate access, and some of it decreased end user experience, right? Because we were backhauling traffic, right? So pervasive security controls across all of the different cloud providers, right? And identity is a new perimeter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the new perimeter. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So adoption challenges, right? So you mentioned the legal space, right? So and there are, I put these into two categories. One, technical adoption challenges, and the other one, cultural. And in some cases, cultural is a bigger challenge than technical.
Absolutely.
Can you sort of talk us through some of your experiences with the adoption of SASE, ZScaler, et cetera?
Yeah. So my own personal story on this is actually a funny one. So I was entirely new to the legal industry when I joined in. Again, it took me maybe 6 months to realize, hey, we've got a real exposure here. And that was what I started looking to what we now know as like a SASE type solution. Well, what was unbeknownst to me at the time, and I probably knew it at a high level, but when I started talking to our CIO and some of our senior IT leaders about what I was thinking, I immediately got hit with, well, what are other law firms doing? And I remember my exact response, which was, I don't care. Okay, my job is to manage and mitigate risk here. Okay, so I have no idea what they're doing, and and I think that we see that in a lot of verticals. So to really kind of be an agent of change, or like transformational change rather than incremental change, is something I see in a lot of verticals, because obviously it's a completely different way of doing things that we've just historically done. So I think that that's part of the cultural side. The technical adoption piece, that's fascinating too, because what I candidly see a lot, and I wanted to make sure that, my own journey was a phased one, right? Because, usually with a SaaS solution, there's going to be a number of underlying microservices that you can continue adding on there. We went about that in a phased approach. So like as an example, I think that some customers, will subscribe to a SaaS service, and they have no idea what it is they bought. They're using it to solve one or two problems when it could be a lot more pervasive, right? So for me, though, really it was all about protecting off-net users, first and foremost. And then from there, I started looking at it year after year. It's like, okay, well, I've got this appliance that is sandboxing, internet downloads. Well, those are instrumented on my internet gateways. If people are going direct to internet from anywhere in the world, its efficacy is deteriorating before my eyes. So that's when I looked at ZScaler Sandbox. And you can imagine, the next year, hey, we had the same thing with a DLP appliance. Why don't we do that in line so we get more control over these transactions? And then, then the next year, hey, you know what? Maybe it's time to start virtualizing our firewalls and our IPSs, right? So so we kind of did it like that. And when I look back at it now, we got a lot right. I mean, obviously there's some things that we could have done better, but for the most part, when it came to adoption, I mean, it was a good approach rather than just saying, give me everything you got and let's just flip a switch.
Right. You said a couple things that resonated. Number one, and just for the folks out there, so what I heard from you was very important around thinking differently, right? Challenging the status quo, right? Not necessarily looking at your competitor to see what they're doing, but really look at yourself, right? And that's the only way we're sort of going to progress. So that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned, hey, we have a problem. There's a use case that we can use, a SASE solution for, a ZScaler for. But then you also have other features and capabilities that may not be immediate needs for the organization that might become shelfware, right? And that's a challenge, right? And that's where CDI is well positioned to sort of help increase adoption and utilization of the platforms, because all software applications have that challenge, right? Where you're not getting full utilization.
Absolutely.
So that makes a lot of sense. So from a day two perspective, right? I think that, and this ties into what I was just mentioning. How are you seeing organizations operate ZScaler, right? Because now we look at SASE, right, as a convergence of identity, network, and security. So those three elements, have to sort of coexist to provide the solution. So do you see organizations sort of after the purchase and adoption of SASE solutions struggling to support the solutions, or is ZDX, the answer that is facilitating that for your customers?
Yeah. So it's kind of a mixed bag, really, because one of the things I always find fascinating is who are the teams internally at various organizations that have the administrative oversight of it, and it's always a mixed bag. It could be security teams, it could be networking teams, it could be IT operation teams, right? Now, what I see in mature organizations is all of those teams will have authorized or privileged users of our platform, and then from there, they'll implement administrative role-based access controls on what they could do. So as an example, your networking team would have full control over establishing, say, GRE or IPsec tunnels, really the whole location management, right? And some of the other traffic forwarding aspects. The security team, well, they're the ones that have administrative access over the enforceable policies, right? The ones that are enforcing your global acceptable use, protecting you from legal liability and all kinds of things. And then the IT operations team, maybe they have access to exception handling. Hey, you know what? The security team, notified us that this URL, which is categorically blocked, has been approved for access, right? So, they can, handle, those service desk tickets. So I do see kind of a mixed approach when it comes to that, but usually those are the more mature implementations. Now, when it comes to ZDX, I didn't get to implement that as a customer, and it wasn't anything I was looking at the time with some of those solutions out there that are, because the thing is, the way that I kind of explained it, and I think it makes sense, it does solve a problem. If somebody is having a problem receiving email and they're sitting in the office, we know how to troubleshoot that. We've been doing that for 20, 30 years. But if you have somebody who's in a hotel in Tokyo and they are having email challenges with like Exchange Online or one of the other SaaS-based email providers, where do you start? Right. I mean, there could be issues with their device. There could be local DNS resolution issues. There could be issues with the hotel Wi-Fi. So ZDX, I think, is playing a really important role in that whole digital experience monitoring when it comes to SaaS application access and some of our business enterprise apps, which are largely moving to the SaaS space.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about use cases. Let's talk a bit about target verticals. I'm of the opinion that all verticals are a target. I mean, if you need an individual to access a resource, whether on premises or in the cloud, shifting to an identity-based strategy makes a lot of sense, right? Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing a vertical where that doesn't exist. Now, one thing that I do see is, though, and I'll use my own experience here, is when it comes to zero trust strategies, those could vary differently. So in the legal space, law firms are an interesting beast. We operate on a need not to know, not a need to know, and we do that for knowledge management. So, if we have an internal document management system that houses legal work product, well, we want to make sure that that's shared across all legal practice groups, unless we have some very specific, what I would call confidentiality or ethical requirements. So we understand confidentiality requirements. You have a client that doesn't want their client matter and its associated work product shared with anyone. Fine. Now, the ethical requirements, let's say your law firm has two customers, Pepsi and Coke. Well, you can't have the same lawyer representing both of those. So, we would have these ethical walls to separate it. But other than that, it was very much ubiquitous access. Now, just about every other industry does not operate like that. So, but I'm sure they have their own nuances as well. So I think that, so to your point, I think, identity as that, really foundational model, I think that fits everywhere. And then from there, some of the zero trust strategies and private application access scenarios will be a little bit different. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. So where do we learn more, right? Where can we get more information about you and also ZScaler?
So, again, my team, one of the other things that we do is we do a lot of exercises like this. So a lot of thought leadership, written content, and, appearance on podcasts. So we have a site called revolutionaries.zscaler.com. All of the members of my team, publish articles and webinars there. And then also we have a sister team, which is a field CTO team, and they do the same. They're a global outfit as well. So I would definitely check that out. And what we also do is too, we have a CXO advisory too, where a lot of our customer CXOs, weigh in with their thoughts and some of their transformation journey stories. So yeah, it's a great resource, and that's just revolutionaries.zscaler.com.
Excellent. So I'm sure we'll throw that up in the screen just so folks can access that. But thank you so much. Thank you for the time. Thank you for driving up and having a chance to chat with us. I certainly learned a lot. I hope folks, learned a lot, that tuned in. I look forward to continuing to collaborate with ZScaler in the field and partnering to help our customers think differently and adopt an identity-based security model. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.
The CDI CTO Podcast is brought to you by CDI, produced by Alyssa Hall and Spencer Grogan. To learn more about CDI, you can visit cdillc.com. The CDI CTO Podcast is a production of CDI Studios.